a stranger wanders into a town with two rival gangs and then puts the services up for the highest bidder. That's basically the story of Yojimbo with the official and unofficial remakes of Fistful of Dollars and Last Man Standing. And we'll kind of get into a little bit of which one was actually which, and which leads to kind of some interesting effects and stuff. Again, John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Hello, hello.
And I thought that one of the things we talk about this week to kind of start things off is this idea of how the director's vision different times can really have a huge impact on, how the story is kind of carried across. And, so in other words, with the different remakes, you may have, just like what we'll talk about more today, of course, you may have like the same basic story, but depending on something about the way that the director kind of expresses the different ideas through visual storytelling or just the combination of different production things and stuff, it just makes a huge impact. I'm just kind of wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think these three were ones where you really saw that. And like you said, there's lots of different ways filmmakers can remake things. You often see, people who are better at visual storytelling. We saw that with Steven Spielberg and a guy named Joe. His was a much more visual story than the original. Others, add more dialogue elements.
Yeah.
And others just completely, they decide to make more of a meta remake, and they just sort of reinvent the story from the inside out and do different things. So it is very interesting to see different people's approaches, and interesting to see someone who's done other movies that are quite good and then screw up a remake, or alternatively, someone who does an unexpectedly good remake of something like this, using exactly the same technique. So it's it's a very sort of interesting mix of how they go about remaking them and what kind of movie you're up for at the end of the day.
Yeah, and it makes me think of that expression about the devil being the details, because it could be like just their use of music, or it could be sometimes just like the thing I kind of go back to a lot of times with something like details is if you ever watch the Breaking Bad series, it's just sometimes certain shots that they use that like really makes it stand out in terms of the visual storytelling. It might be something like where the character Walt will be like looking, maybe he's looking in the bin where he's like kind of mixing up the chemicals and stuff. And, usually a filmmaker might just do some, kind of shots, like kind of profile shots, or maybe a little bit close up. But, Vince Gilligan would just, definitely, and not necessarily himself, because he's the showrunner, but he's not directing every episode. But then whoever the director is will choose to have a shot where like it's you in the barrel kind of looking out at, like kind of Walt looking in and stuff. It's just little things like that, like kind of just, it doesn't really change the story, but it changes, it gives the audience a sense of feeling that like, the filmmaker is kind of paying attention to these different things.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something you definitely can see when you're watching movies that have been remade from, say, the 40s or the 50s to the modern day, because the camera angles and the technical ability of those camera angles changes over time quite dramatically.
Yeah.
And you see that really in people who are seen as real groundbreaking filmmakers. Like Citizen Kane is a very visual movie in terms of storytelling, and very different, I would say, from a lot of movies at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at some of the sort of movies of the 40s, I mean, movies obviously use the stage as their basis, and so a lot of films will be filmed in that you can see the entire room, you can see the people moving about in the room, and those tend to be very dialogue heavy, tend to be very well written actually generally, but they tend to be quite static and quite stage-like in their presentation.
Yes.
Whereas it's when you start to see more interesting filmmakers use just different visual effects, like Hitchcock with all this sort of random animation, or very sort of close-up shots of people's faces, or very sort of high contrasting sort of images and dramatic angles, is really where the visual storytelling has started to come into its own. And I think these three movies are all very good examples of different types of visual storytelling.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I know what your take on Yojimbo, the original, was in terms of that, but
Yeah, I think so. Here we have, Akira Kurosawa, of course. We can kind of call it a little bit of a follow-up to Seven Samurai, but of course, like there was a few movies in between the two. Um, but to me, what comes across is that he's definitely, been refining his craft more and more and stuff like that. Just even within the few films, we can kind of see that, like, there's different things that he's starting to kind of bring that becomes more distinctly his kind of thumbprint on, like kind of what Akira Kurosawa movie is and stuff. In between, like, like one of the movies that we'll be talking about in the future is Hidden Fortress and stuff, which again is another, movie that kind of ends up, being an unofficial remake and stuff, or unofficially remade for Star Wars and stuff. And here also we see like he's working with, his Johnny Depp, Toshiro Mifune, who comes back in this movie with a very different, character. I mean, it's just striking how, like kind of he's a cartoonish character in Seven Samurai, and here, like, he's like kind of just very much like kind of the man with no name.
Yeah. I mean, he's just sort of stamped with Clint Eastwood's kind of trademark almost from the get-go, and yeah, I mean, that's all due respect to Toshiro Mifune, because it's as if Johnny Depp had just turned into Clint Eastwood almost when you watch this movie compared to Seven Samurai.
Right.
And I mean, he's very sort of serious, level-headed, threatening, and sort of logical and calculating and strategic, which is a totally different sort of character from the Kikuchiro character. But there's a lot of interesting sort of, again though, he adds, what I really like about his performances are he adds these certain quirks of physicality and habits to his characters that just make them slightly offbeat and interesting. Like in this one, he's constantly has his arms hidden, like, which is kind of like a visual metaphor for the character, in that he's hiding his intentions from everyone, but he only reveals his hand, so to speak, when he's either sort of like threatening someone or making a deal or eating, basically. And so most of the movie, he's got his hands covered. Then whenever he's about to negotiate, a hand comes out, either from the left or the right. I was actually trying to track it to see if there was some correlation between when he helped the Saki team Saki or Team Silk, as I'm going to call them, because I can't remember all their names. But was that the left hand or was it the right hand? I wasn't really paying enough attention, but it was very obvious that was kind of how it was portrayed. That as if in cards you would reveal your hand, you did the same thing visually with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting how the other aspect is, whereas before we had his character like kind of he was just along for the ride, and like didn't really matter like kind of what his reward was going to be. But here we have a very mercenary character who's all about the money. In fact, that's really what kind of triggers this kind of escalation, is the fact that like he's basically selling his services to the highest bidder, and so it's also, what's interesting is that like that's also part of how his character changes during the course of the movie, because it seems like that's his sole motivation in the beginning, to simply, just the money, and like, who's going to pay him the most is going to basically get him as the hired gun. But somewhere along the way, he develops a conscience, and unlike some other movies where you might kind of question, like, is that realistic and stuff like that, somehow it works. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what it is about, like, kind of, that like we see like somehow the shift happening and stuff. And maybe partially it's because like different times we are like just with him and like watching, like seeing what he's seeing, I guess, and stuff. And I feel like that's kind of what he sees initially, is like kind of two, silly gangs that like you can kind of, basically take advantage of. And I guess when he starts seeing like kind of what's at stake, this family, right, where the one, woman and the child is being separated and stuff by this kind of rivalry and stuff. I feel like, maybe this kind of goes back a little bit to what we talked before about in Mandalorian, where he saw himself in this child the Baby Yoda and stuff, and then that's kind of when everything changed. And we had that happen also in Seven Samurai, where Kikuchio saw like kind of this baby, and he was literally in tears and stuff. But here it's not as emotional, but I think he still like sees the connection somehow. And he doesn't really say, like, unlike some other movies where they explain things away with the dialogue. Here we just kind of see that, like there's something about like kind of that he sees that connection, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting journey that the protagonist goes on in this movie, because, like you said, he seems like a kind of a strategic person who's out for own personal gain and becomes this sort of quite altruistic character during the course of the movie. But I think as well, this is something that I found really clever and really interesting about Akira Kurosawa's movies, because a lot of the setup in a lot of these movies is almost like there's some kind of battle, there's some kind of scheme, and there's a lot of strategizing, and people kind of like, trying to outwit each other to begin with. And then about a third to halfway through, there's a very kind of emotional, sort of familial or parental story that comes in that really always takes you off guard. It's like in Seven Samurai, what really took me off guard was when you realize about Rikichi's wife was abducted and she's too ashamed to live with herself in this. And that's a real kind of emotional blow that really comes out of nowhere. And the same I found with Yojimbo, the idea that, this mother's been taken away from her kid, and yet the father is so in love with her that he still lives next door. I mean, it's so tragic, and it's this real kind of, he likes to sort of get these real kind of emotional gut punches, like some way through the movie, because it's almost like you're so caught up in all the strategizing that you forget the real impact that this is having. And I think he does that to kind of bring you back to see that, all these idiots who are all kind of like scheming, they're ruining people's lives in the process. And I think it's a really good sort of metaphor for how people's, bad things that happen in the real world, the real effects they have that we don't often see them at first view.
And he does that visually too in an interesting way, because the first time that we kind of really see the gangs, like literally see them all, is that we're up in the tower, right, with Sanjuro, and we see them at a distance and stuff. And then when we get to that familiar story, that the family stuff, we're there on the ground, and he's like literally like the mother is like kind of outside this window and stuff like that, from the kid who's inside with Sanjuro and stuff like that, and they're separated by this window, and so he's like right there, and we're there with them and stuff like that, and like actually the point of view is kind of goes a little bit back and forth between we're on the outside looking in and then the inside looking out at the mother and stuff like that. And it's interesting how visually he kind of like has that detachment, and then we're eyes on the ground. We are with the characters, and then seeing like kind of them being like literally like ripped apart and stuff.
Yeah, and I think as well the difference between Seven Samurai and this is that Seven Samurai feels like, even though it's based in a way it's around a village, but for some reason it seems like a much bigger movie visually. You kind of seem like you've got the hills around the village, and there's different aspects, and it's almost like played out like a series of sort of battlegrounds almost. And it has this very kind of structured feeling visually in lots of different locations, whereas this feels much more confined. You just feel very, very kind of claustrophobic. And when you first and I think it was the first sort of half an hour, 40 minutes of this movie, I really didn't know what was going on. It just seemed like he was in this tiny village and there were these two gangs. But what's clever about it is that, you realize in just this very small, closed-in little village that's tiny, there's so many kind of machinations of all the different characters going on, all this manipulation that's happening, and he's trying to sort of work his way into it. And I think, he heightens that visually as well with a lot of the scenes inside the houses with these very, very strong contrasting lights. If you notice, there are these really, really strong shadows cast against everything, and very bright lights on all the characters. And it gives it almost like this two-dimensional kind of shadow puppetry effect on a lot of the scenes. And there's one, and the one that really strikes out, there's a couple that really struck me visually, was the one where he confronts the two assassins that kill the magistrate. And there are these huge, I don't know what they are, these big circular kind of shadows of, I don't know if they're barrels or corn or something like this. And he's just kind of like, there is this kind of, you know, it's this shadow that's walking along, kind of pursuing them against these really sort of bold shadows. And again, when he's been kind of, when he's been beaten up, there's this bit where he's walking towards the undertakers, and it's almost like he's crawling along the two dimensions of this shadow towards, and it almost looks like he's crawling along in 2D to the undertaker's shop. And again, it kind of had this weird effect of visually making you almost watch like you're watching a very kind of cartoon sort of thing, you know, in a way.
Right.
And you kind of get shades of that in things, you know, it reminded me of things like Sin City or stuff that has a very stylized visual look. Or yeah,
definitely, like he plays around with that, like kind of, you said, you know, like with the shadows and stuff. The other thing is like proportions. This is actually, you know, I have to give credit to this other video that you know, where he, like, different times, if you notice, he loves to kind of put, you know, Toshiro Mifune as larger than life and stuff, until like later on, you know, like kind of where you know, he's, you know, when he's beaten up and stuff like that, he's now all of a sudden like kind of, you know, he's no longer, you know, kind of larger than life. He's like literally just, you know, like then he plays with the scale of like where you see him more on the level with the other, you know, kind of gang members and stuff like that. But before then, like, you know, the first battle scenes, right, where he, like, you know, with a flash of sword, he kills multiple guys like all at once, like when he went by the coffin maker and he says like, and then like 2, maybe 3, and he just kind of, you know, like, you know, it's kind of like Babe Ruth calling out, like, you know, I'm gonna hit a, you know, and slam and stuff like that. And he kind of, like, you know, whacks these guys like kind of, you know, in a matter of seconds and stuff like that. But then that kind of goes away, you know, like kind of later on, and then, you know, like likewise, it's portrayed where he's like kind of just, you know, more on the level, and I feel like that's also this idea that, like, besides like kind of visually showing that like he's like kind of taken down a notch, it's also like kind of raising the stakes, like, you know, that in other words, you know, okay, you have this family that's kind of counting on him and stuff like that, and then also, like, you know, he's not quite as, it's almost like the idea of Superman is nothing without like kind of kryptonite and stuff. He's not as real, I guess.
Well, I mean, he goes from calling the shots on the coffins to being carried out in one.
Right, yeah.
You know, and I mean, I really love this kind of poetic sort of thing of him, you know, peering out from the coffin and laughing at what's going on. You know, that's a very interesting kind of, you know, look at his philosophy on mortality, or how, I don't know, it's got me thinking about all sorts of things. But they're going back as well, the difference in the characters between this and Seven Samurai. We often talk about this thing where actors will establish themselves as particular types of characters. And you almost feel like Akira Kurosawa is using what we know of Toshiro Mifune from Seven Samurai and subverting our expectations in this, because he starts off as kind of just an aimless kind of traveler, and you think he's going along for the ride as well. And then it slowly becomes apparent that he's kind of calling the shots, and in really clever ways, which really kind of is so different. And it's almost like I want to watch all of the movies with Toshiro Mifune that Akira Kurosawa did, to see what he does, what journey he takes him on. And I think the only other director I can think of that does that in interesting ways is probably Quentin Tarantino, because he takes characters we've known from other movies, and sometimes he repeats them, but he often adds new kind of elements that we weren't quite expecting.
Right.
You know, I think of like Kurt Russell and how he's dealt with, you know, Sam Jackson and Kurt Russell in various different movies. And
right.
There's all sort of interesting, different sort of twists on their characters. So
definitely. Let's see. Somebody, I guess, we kind of, we talked a little bit about the kind of innkeeper who, like, kind of is, meanwhile, like, when we have like kind of the family separation, stuff like that, he's a lot of it plays out that he's actually in the, you know, this inn and stuff like that. That this, for some reason, like, I don't know, like, that's partially what's an interesting kind of question is, like, you know, here's this guy who basically he's got a little business to kind of, you know, like, as far as you know, like, you know, other than Sanjuro and stuff. We don't know who else eats at his place or like kind of uses the services and stuff. But somehow he's able to kind of stay in business. And then the other thing I think is interesting is we have like this. We kind of alluded to a little bit is that here we are in feudal Japan, and like, and I think we touched on this a little bit with Lone Wolf, that the women are really just property. I mean, and in Seven Samurai, that it was some kind of bet, I guess, that the husband lost, and then so because of that, the guy, like the winner, just lay claim to his wife and stuff. I mean, talk about the Me Too generation, like kind of being far, far in the future yet to come and stuff.
Yeah, and I think it was really interesting the way he's, that there's the scene that's really striking is the bit where he's just sided with, I don't know which team it is, whether it's Saki or Silk. I think it seems Silk is the one with the sort of the house of the whorehouse, basically. And then they sort of present him. There's this weird sort of musical bit where they're all kind of like playing instruments, and it's just like the way it's shot in this very, very high contrast, and it just makes the women so unattractive. It's just like this. He does this great job of like sort of making them almost like sort of machines, and there's kind of like a very machine-like behavior to them that makes the entire thing very unappealing. He does a good job of that.
Yeah,
but it was a real nightmarish scene. But
in that time frame, like what's called 60s thereabouts and stuff. A lot of times you have soft lighting for women because it kind of makes them more attractive and stuff like that. And like you said, it's very harsh lighting, so it just does a very kind of, along with the music and stuff, it has a very grating effect.
Totally, yeah. And I mean, from Seven Samurai, I mean, he managed to make the leading lady in that attractive, even with the boy's haircut, and he shot it, beautifully amongst flowers and stuff, even when she's running away from whoever it was, I can't remember now. But so he's really gone out of his way to make them as unattractive as possible in that scene. So but it was a very interesting. It almost looked like David Lynch or something, just that sort of real harsh lighting and purposeful unattractiveness of the people in the scene was bizarre.
And that's the thing that I think there was some offer of him for Sanjuro to stay with the women or something like that, and he basically wanted to have nothing to do with that.
Well, he described it as this place is too dangerous, I think, and walks off, which I thought was a very well, I mean, they had threatened to sort of kill him and take the money. They just paid him a few days before, so
and that was something that was interesting too. It's like some different times, I guess he actually overheard the conversations, or I'm trying to remember now, like that he got wind of the fact that that they were gonna that he thought or his plan was to kind of play them, but then somehow I guess he realized, they're looking to play him as well.
Well, that's what I kind of liked about the original of this, is that he actually, the story is well written enough and well directed enough that you can kind of see how he goes about learning information and how he goes about manipulating the situations much more clearly than either Fistful of Dollars or Last Man Standing. And you're right. He does overhear the conversation, and there's little bits of information that he kind of just sort of gleans from other things and other stuff he figures out, but it isn't all like him kind of just magically figuring it all out, which is sometimes how you kind of felt with some of the others. But it's a very interesting way that he sort of does try to manipulate them, and he comes from a different sort of position in that he comes in as a stranger, but a stranger of relative strength. I mean, certainly that's done visually, but in terms of the society, he's a samurai and he's surrounded by basically thugs, and some of which are bigger or have weapons but aren't trained to his level. So he has that as a clear differentiator from the other characters. And of course, the other differentiator is the code of honor, which comes through halfway through.
And the thing that we find as well, like speaking kind of code of honor stuff, what kind of breaks that a little bit is the introduction of a gun. I mean, we saw it a little bit with Seven Samurai and stuff, because like one of the things that like they right away tried to kind of basically capture stuff was the rifles, and in this case, it's a revolver and stuff, and just like a what to us nowadays would be like a simple handgun, something like that. But back then, right, when we're talking swords, having that is like kind of one upping the or kind of stacking the odds in your favor.
Yeah, and it's done very well. I mean, he does a good job of directing that character and making him seem like he has complete power over the situation because of his beloved gun.
Spoiler alert, until he doesn't.
yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's something that we see a little bit going forward. Some, and we'll kind of talk about that. But it's definitely different in how it's executed. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say as well, what's kind of interesting was this idea that the policeman you learn very quickly that he's totally useless. That there's just no law whatsoever in this town.
Right.
So, you certainly can't rely, the Wild West, I'm sure this is like influence of, American Westerns on Akira Kurosawa and the lawless town, basically. So it's interesting to see how they reinvent that character in the various remakes as well. What he turns into.
Yeah, that's absolutely what his intent was kind of, subvert or play with the American Western genre and stuff. And so I don't know if you kind of like, if there's other things you kind of want to talk about, or maybe it's hard to kind of.
No. Okay. I think, as I say, Yojimbo is probably one of those movies that you can rewatch quite a few times and find new things in it. So, I would recommend people do that. Definitely. But yeah, we can move on to A Fistful of Dollars.
Yeah, so the funny part, of course, is that like here we have, like kind of an actual Western, and again, like kind of it's now, having this Fistful of Dollars, the Sergio Leone is basically he's playing with his version of the Western genre, because here's an Italian making a Western, right? I mean, that's the simplest kind of way to put it, and he's basing it on a Japanese, director that's also playing with the Western genre and everything. So it's I don't even know if you can kind of call it circular, but it's definitely some kind of funny cycle, I guess, going on.
Well, I mean, I think that's being very nice to Sergio Leone. I mean, he basically stole everything from Yojimbo.
That's a whole and
put in this. I mean, Akira Kurosawa apparently sort of said to him, that's a great movie you made, but it's my movie. And when you watch them back to back, you realize Fistful of Dollars is almost, scene for scene, a copy of Yojimbo with just a few little bits added. But in a funny sort of way. I mean, I remember watching spaghetti westerns, particularly Sergio Leone's movies, when I was younger, and not really understanding them, because there's not much dialogue in them. Right. And when there is, it's often dubbed, and you can't really quite understand what people are saying. You can understand Clint Eastwood, but he didn't really say much, so you kind of have to pay attention. But I mean, it was actually quite nice watching Yojimbo beforehand, because I kind of knew what was actually going on in it for once. So
yeah, I think it's funny, like where unlike nowadays where there's just this expectation of like at least giving credit to the fact that like you're borrowing like based on like kind of Yojimbo and stuff like that as a minimum and everything. But in this case, like it was a ripoff that like I think I saw an interview where part of the discussion was that like they really didn't expect it to blow up like so in other words they figured they would make some money and just kind of be this kind of Italian movie that like Italians watch and stuff like that. But next thing you know, it kind of went overseas and just kind of made X number of times. So the funny part, from what I also understand, is that after the lawsuit and stuff like that, Akira Kurosawa apparently has made more money from the money from that lawsuit from this movie than other movies that he's made on his own in Japan. So that's another kind of that I don't I can't verify that, but that was at least in the interview what was discussed and stuff.
Well, I'm glad that he did make some money off it, because it is pretty blatant. But I mean, but in some respects, you have to. It's very easy, as we've well learned, to make a bad remake. And actually, Sergio Leone does a really good remake of Yojimbo. Fistful of Dollars is really interesting. It's what's interesting for me was he takes the most emotional part of the Yojimbo and he puts it front and center right from the word go. Right. He meets the kid, and that in a way actually makes Clint Eastwood's character a little less complicated, because you kind of have this in your back of your mind that he's got that kid, he's thinking about this kid the whole way through the movie. And so his actions are much more, his altruistic actions are much more sort of front of your mind, unless you're less sort of, thinking about what he's going to strategize next, as you would with Yojimbo. But yeah, it is a good remake, my favorite thing is, the fact that he managed it. Oh, and there's this saying, right? What is the Rojo, the bad guy? He says, if you want to shoot someone with a rifle, you shoot for the heart, right? You go for the heart first. Right. And I kind of felt like, well, that's what Sergio Leone did with this. He said, right, I'm gonna take the most emotional part of that, and I'm gonna shoot for the heart with this movie, and I'm gonna go straight from the word go.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
What is the Rojo, the bad guy? He says, if you want to shoot someone with a rifle, you shoot for the heart, right? You go for the heart first. Right. And I kind of felt like, well, that's what Sergio Leone did with this. He said, right, I'm gonna take the most emotional part of that, and I'm gonna shoot for the heart with this movie, and I'm gonna go straight from the word go. But yeah, I mean, it's no easy feat to make it, to change it from swords and hammers to guns, and make it still kind of fairly realistic and interesting and compelling. Well, maybe not. Yeah, I'm sure there's some bits that aren't realistic, but it's definitely a compelling, intense movie. That's for sure.
And it's funny how this is the unofficial remake, because it just basically was not really sanctioned or licensed and all that. And then also Clint Eastwood as tied to the Sergio Leone movies as we can imagine stuff, but he was actually not the first choice. Apparently, Henry Fonda, James Coburn, Charles Bronson were the choices above Clint Eastwood and everything, who at that time was just doing television westerns and stuff, and it was not nearly as well known. And the reason ultimately turned out was budget. And he came cheaper than any of the other bigger stars at the time. So that's kind of ironic that something that we figure is kind of how you can't separate kind of the two and stuff like that. But and then ultimately, of course, what's funny is that he still ended up working with these other stars and other movies like Once Upon a Time in the West and stuff. So he still, I guess, once he did get more money, he still ended up working with these stars he wanted.
Yeah, absolutely. It did make me think, though. I mean, I'm sure he learned his lesson from this, but it did make me want to kind of watch the other two movies in the kind of trilogy and think, what movies is he ripping off here? Is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly just like a rip off of an old 30s, Western or something? But yeah, I think what makes it work, though, and what makes it different from a lot of Westerns that went before it, is that he captures the same kind of grittiness of Akira Kurosawa's movie. When Clint Eastwood gets beaten up, the camera stays on him and he gets beaten up badly, and you see him sort of struggle away like Sanjuro in Yojimbo. And when people get shot, it's fairly kind of, it's gruesome in a kind of a, 60s splatter, tomato sauce splatter blood kind of way. But it doesn't kind of gloss or glamorize that too much, which is also something that Yojimbo doesn't do, and something Akira Kurosawa movies don't do. They don't sort of glamorize anything that's going on. And so the fact that he managed to retain that and kind of put it in a different context and make the Clint Eastwood character still compelling was quite an achievement, actually, in many ways.
Yeah, and another way they kind of subvert the genre is his use of close-ups, where that tends to be used just for reactions, in traditional westerns. And here he really plays with it, where kind of uses it as a way to kind of tighten things up, to kind of ratchet up the tension and stuff. And here's the funny part, though. Apparently, that was also budget driven, because different times that's saved on the cost of some kind of way that the way the film was like I guess apparently copied and stuff like that. And I the details are really kind of beyond me, even though I've done some filmmaking stuff. But apparently that was also partially what drove that decision as well. But it's interesting how it's to great effect though. Like it's something that like becomes distinctly his. When we think of Sergio Leone movies and stuff, you see it like kind of throughout the Dollar series and stuff like that. And it's just something that like it just becomes his kind of trademark.
Yeah, there's also, I mean, something I often find when I'm watching, the Dollar movies is that they feel very lonely movies. Clint Eastwood really feels like a very isolated character. And I think that's obviously, the locations, he's very much isolated. He seems to be the only Caucasian most of the time, surrounded by, Hispanics people. But there's also this thing of, like, because all the other actors are Italian and they've been dubbed into English afterwards, it's almost like he's in this sort of alien land where he's the only one who's speaking real English and everyone else is kind of, it's like the audience is listening through a universal translator, like a Babel fish or something, because everyone is slightly out of sync, but he's the only one that's in sync.
Right.
And in a weird sort of way, even though it's not really intentional, was probably budget driven and all sorts of things. It has this way of making you focus very much on Clint Eastwood as the character because you can understand him. And but it's a really, you could artificially do that in a movie, and it would be a very interesting creative choice. But as even though it's unintentional here.
And I think we talked about it before though, that it was a budget thing of where like they would shoot like, him in English and everybody else in Italian stuff. And so that's what's kind of ironic is that like, I don't even know how you shoot a movie like that where, the actors are speaking different languages and everything. Somehow, I guess they have to still understand what's going on. But and I guess Clint Eastwood's stuntman apparently was the translator for him and stuff like that. But it's kind of got to be so weird though, like like in other words, other than that coming across from like kind of just watching it, but I mean, just having been on different sets, I can't even really imagine how you kind of like function and stuff.
Well, I mean, in a way, it's really effective because they're always stories about like a stranger who turns out we're in town where he doesn't belong, and so he
really is a stranger.
Yeah, I mean, the weakness of that is that sometimes you don't really know what's going on in the story because it's so disjointed. But yeah, I mean, it's, as I say, it's an interesting way of making movies, definitely.
And I guess it does like kind of part of what creates a little bit of tension then is that like, when they're looking at each other, they really are wondering what's going on.
Yeah. And I mean, in a way, it's kind of like, it's testament to Clint Eastwood's acting ability as well, because he was probably, he wouldn't have known what was going on and everyone else would have at least understood each other. It's kind of like a weird sort of green screen effect in that, you've got to act like you know what everyone else is saying, which is interesting. Yeah.
And then, like kind of in this case, we kind of have the secret weapon, right? Like instead of being like a pistol, because everyone's got pistols, right? And now a Winchester rifle.
Yeah, it's the Winchester rifle. Well, but he has his own kind of upgrade, superpower as well. He's got his shield, his his iron shield, which is a cool ending as well. Because again, that was really cleverly done, and you see him kind of like shooting the metal and hitting it with a hammer and stuff, and this thing. You don't know if it's him trying to kind of like get the feeling back in his hands because someone stamped on it. So you don't really understand it, and then it all becomes very apparent. They did that quite cleverly.
Yeah.
So yeah. Yeah.
One other kind of like note was the actress. I'm trying to remember like her actual name. Let's see here, Marianne Coach. She's apparently actually like a German actress and stuff. So it was like interesting that kind of like she's in the setting or everyone's Hispanic or like that. Not including Clint Eastwood, of course. And the name though, like I think that's one thing that's kind of somewhat where in this case this is the mother, right, and that is trying to be reunited with the son and stuff like that. The name Marisol is actually a reference to the Virgin Mary. So it's interesting how even with the name, you know, kind of Sergio Leone is kind of like basically heightening, you know, like kind of this idea that like, you know, even if though, you know, she's kind of been kind of living this life of shame, so to speak, and everything like that, but she still somehow retains this kind of purity because of how like, you know, she's, you know, like kind of this mother, and like that's her goal and all this stuff is to be reunited and everything. So it's kind of interesting how like, you know, just even with the name and stuff, there's this kind of, you know, little nod, I guess, to this idea of, you know, the Holy Mother, I guess, and stuff.
Yeah, it's an interesting angle on it, on this, you know, idea of the displaced mother, you know, with the kid. But I mean, you know, I like the fact that he still keeps that element of the story, having the father and the child right next to him. But yeah. I mean, aside from that, I mean, well, the only other thing I can say that is an improvement is the Ennio Morricone soundtrack. I was gonna say,
yeah,
which I've had going around in my head for days now after watching it. So
easily, yeah.
Yeah. So and it's funny actually. I mean, I thought the music for Seven Samurai was quite memorable and was very, very impactful, but the music in Yojimbo really didn't stay with me at all.
Yeah, we'll have to kind of look a little bit more at that, but I can't say why that is exactly, to be honest. Other than, you know, I didn't really look at, you know, was it the same composer or kind of, you know, but
yeah.
But definitely, you know, like this is probably like, you know, I think it's like maybe the start, right, of the lifelong partnership that these two creators have had, because like, you know, Enrico Morricone ends up like kind of in each of the other films with Sergio Leone. He's just as much as part of the package, you know, as just, you know, probably like some of these other actors and stuff like that, like Clint Eastwood.
And you need that good soundtrack because there's not a lot of dialogue, really. You know, not a lot of people say very much in Sergio Leone's movies. There's a lot of like scenes of tension and people not saying very much, and or a bit of shooting, and you know.
And so the music really then is part of the storytelling. And and apparently here's one of the techniques that he used though, was that like he would different times have the music composed before shooting and stuff. And like, so when an actor is like preparing for a scene and stuff like that, he would play the music for, you know, the actor to let him know, like, kind of, you know, like, this is your music and stuff like that. And then other times, another times when he was apparently setting up, like, you know, some kind of, you know, reveal, like a wide shot or something like that, he would again, like, kind of play the music to the cameraman so that he knows, like, kind of when this, like, kind of crescendo was happening, like that, you know, kind of, you know, and so the camera would move to the surging music and stuff.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, this was back in the, of course, you know, we had movies back then where people had identifiable themes. You know, so much movie music now is just kind of trying to create a feeling in particular things, but there's no real character to a lot of the scores. You know, so I mean, virtually, you're right. Every movie that Ennio Morricone did, there's just like a distinctive theme that goes along with the movie, and you kind of feel like it's Clint Eastwood's, you know, theme in most of them. And you know, all the 80s movies, there was like every character, you know, almost had their own theme, and then that's kind of all got lost in the 90s, really, it seems, and then in the 2000s, or it just didn't work very well when they tried it.
And it's funny how, like you said, like, we have it so connected to Clint Eastwood that if we hear that harmonica, right, it's like right away, you know, that the image comes, you know, kind of, like, even before we see Clint Eastwood, like, kind of the image comes to mind and stuff like that. Or other times, if we see him and stuff, you know, the music comes, it's kind of, in other words, it's almost like you can't separate the two.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that I've just thought about in terms of, you know, the classic sort of man with no name image is the fact that he's wearing the poncho.
Yes.
Because this is obviously something he's, you know, there's this cowboy who's kind of lost in Mexico wearing, you know, some sort of Mexican clothing, but he's not Mexican, you know, so why is he wearing, you know, it's a very kind of weird thing. Again, it's kind of playing with this idea of like someone who's out of place. but is obviously still kind of can handle themselves. But, yeah.
Yeah, and it's just kind of just all part of the kind of iconography, I guess, of the Man with No Name and stuff.
Yeah. So speaking of music and of things out of place, perhaps this is as good a time as any to start talking about Last Man Standing.
Yeah. Okay, so this is apparently the official remake that was sanctioned by, Akira Kurosawa and stuff, set in the Prohibition era. But as we'll see, it's just, I don't know, somehow like just because it's a quote unquote official remake doesn't necessarily make it better.
No, I mean, yeah, like I say, for me, the most jarring thing about this, I don't know if it was because this was, this was before Sin City, but there was this weird thing. The music is this weird mixture of warped bass guitars and bongos, and I'm just like, why? What is going on? It sounds like a kind of like a household sort of post-party jam. That's kind of in its dying hours of the party, and it's all going a bit wrong because people are tired or something. The music is just shockingly bad all the way through this, and whenever it came on, I was just like, "Oh God, why?" At least
this movie bombed pretty bad.
I bet, yeah. I don't know that, to be honest with you, if they used more period music, it would be any better. It kind of reminded me a lot of Angel Heart with Mickey Rourke in the general theme of everyone's terribly hot and humid. And I seem to remember there was a similar kind of soundtrack in that, but it maybe wasn't quite so bad. But yeah, that got me right from the get-go.
And I guess, like kind of overall, it's an interesting kind of production because of how, here's Bruce Willis, who, like he had like kind of, with Die Hard and stuff like that, like a pretty big film and stuff like that. And then like something happened in the 90s where he just really struggled to find traction again. Like in the 80s, he was really going strong and stuff like that. And then I don't know what happened to his, kind of his acting mojo, or like kind of it's somehow like he just seemed to kind of really lost his way, I guess, to some degree.
But he was another actor saved by Quentin Tarantino, because 94 was Pulp Fiction, this was 96. So he had reestablished himself as a kind of a tough guy. But I guess the thing was, before that, it's John McClane. He was a very kind of do-gooder, tough guy. Whereas in Pulp Fiction, they showed him a slightly nastier kind of heroic guy who wasn't necessarily heroic, and so they're kind of playing on that a little bit, that kind of character in this one, or they try to anyway. So he sleeps with prostitutes and he kind of like kills people just to establish himself in the town, and he's generally not a particularly likable character, but and they try and obviously work in the same kind of story. But yeah, my main complaint with this movie is, again, it's sound related, because both in Yojimbo has a fair amount of dialogue, but it's sparse and it's effective. When people do speak, it's to do with a particular scenario, strategy, or something that's going on. In Fistful of Dollars, there's just a lot less dialogue and it's more visual, and or you just got the great soundtrack in the background. This has neither a great soundtrack and not really good dialogue either. But what they try and do is, rather than tell the story visually or through the scenes or the plot, they just have Bruce Willis narrating the entire thing. So it's just like a constant stream of exposition of Smith's character. And whereas you kind of think that, you sometimes wonder what would be going through the Man with No Name's head in various situations when you're watching things like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, or Fistful of Dollars. There's no mystery. You just know that what he's thinking is a whole stream of very cliched dialogue, and it leaves nothing to the imagination. And again, it's just so much exposition. And it's not him, it's the barkeeper who's kind of telling him all about the town. He goes, there's two groups, there's him and him, they don't like each other, and they're probably going to shoot each other, and the coffin makers, he's making lots of bodies, and oh, you know, I wonder how this all ends. Maybe you'll make some money here. You know, it's just like,
Yeah, I mean, I think what you said kind of really says it all for all these, you know, because here you have like kind of, William Sanderson, who's, you know, best known for like kind of from Blade Runner and stuff.
yeah,
Bruce Stern, who's also like, you know, a top-notch actor in a lot of other movies that like, you know, sooner or later we'll run across him again and everything. You know, Michael Imperioli before Sopranos and stuff. And he's just like, you know, each of these characters, they're just underutilized. Like they're really good actors. And probably the biggest sin is Christopher Walken, who like he's not allowed to be Christopher Walken. He's like kind of this menacing kind of, you know, slow talking. And it's like, you know, let him be Christopher Walken for crying out loud.
Yeah, I
let
mean,
him be his freakish, weird kind of, you know, character that he typically is. So.
Yeah. They give him a scar and a backstory of him burning an orphanage, but then they don't really have anything in his actual performance that's quirky or interesting at all, really. He's obviously quite menacing, but, you know, not much else. I think as well, it's also, the whole setting is just really bizarre for me. It's like, because you get all these people who've been supplanted from Chicago in a very sort of back of town, you know, country Mexican village, and they're running alcohol from Mexico to the US. I mean, I don't know if that really happened, but it just seemed very unlikely. I don't know why, or maybe it's just I'm too used to the cliches of, you know, Chicago prohibition movies or something, but
yeah, I mean, I can't speak to like kind of like you said, like kind of whether it was realistic or not and stuff. But here's the thing, though, too. Like we just don't care. You know, like kind of. There's really like nobody that we're really like. You know, in theory, the man with no name is who we're supposed to be rooting for, and stuff like that. And you know, I just feel like that like there just wasn't anything. You know, like even though that like we have the same basic beats and stuff that he's going kind of to the highest bidder, and then he has a change of heart and stuff. But unlike, you know, like kind of the other movies, and you know, like kind of whether it's Sanjuro or Clint Eastwood's character, we really don't feel the same sympathy though. Like we just like, okay, it has, to me, it's not even nothing, or it's not even the fact that like he's sleeping with prostitutes and stuff. It's just that like we just don't feel like there's anything that kind of makes us want to like really root for him.
Well, I mean, the main problem, another key problem with this is they take the most emotional pull of the whole story out. I mean, the whole thing of like the mother who's been separated from her family now, whereas they, you know, they're within, you can visually see the kid running to his mother in Yojimbo and a Fistful of Dollars. This one, they're in Mexico. They're not there. Yeah. So again, you're just having to rely on, again, Smith's account of what's happened and just explaining it all. And so, you know, Bruce Willis, great action, everything, but you're not going to be able to recreate that emotional pull by just describing it, you know, in a scene. And so you don't really care about her. You don't see any of that kind of struggle. The husband's nowhere to be seen. He saves her, and he doesn't really have any compelling reason to do so. I mean, in Yojimbo, it's a Bushido code. In Fistful of Dollars, you know, they kind of at least do the background work that he feels sorry for the kid and the family, and you can kind of see them expressing that. In this, it's kind of like he just seems to sort of randomly save her. But apart from that, he seems like a fairly cutthroat mercenary. It doesn't really make any sense with the rest of what he's doing the rest of the time at all.
I mean, apparently he has some kind of weakness, I guess, for, you know, like kind of, you know, damsel distress and stuff. But again, it's through his, you know, dialogue or his kind of, you know, narration, you know, kind of voiceover and stuff. It's not through something that like kind of shows us why he has this weakness and everything. It's just kind of, it's like he's sleeping with these different women, but then somehow this one kind of magically makes him, I guess, care more and stuff. And it's like him saying like, oh man, I just, you know, I don't know what it is, but I'm in trouble. Like, you know, like it's just him saying that and stuff.
But I mean, that's the problem again, is that they're trying not to give too much away. But he's still narrating everything. So even though, you know, it's almost like, okay, maybe you're trying to do something clever where he's deceiving himself that he feels more for these characters than he will explain to himself. But it's a bit of a jump for the audience to have to make. It's kind of like you'd be better off just not saying anything, like in Fistful of Dollars, and letting it up to people's, imagination to think, oh, well, actually, he does care about these people,
Right.
Whereas in this, it's like, I don't really care about these people, and I'm telling you I don't care about them, but I just did something that kind of implies that I do. So it's kind of like, well, do you, it's just, it doesn't work at all. And also the other thing to mention, of course, in this is that we're in post John Woo territory. So everyone that gets shot seems to fly backwards about 10 feet. There's everyone who, I don't know what they put in those bullets, but I mean, it makes you fly like about 20 feet. I mean, I've not been in any real gun battles, so who am I to say? But I don't know that even from watching whatever, candid stuff gets shown on the internet, I don't see people flying 10 feet or 15 feet.
I mean, even like kind of, the scenes of battle, right? That, like kind of Saving Private Ryan was kind of considered one of the most authentic battle scenes, like on, the storming Omaha Beach and stuff. You don't see any of the soldiers fly. Kind of, like this is kind of one of those realistic / most brutal battles and stuff. But okay, granted, there were some times that the soldiers were flying, but it was because of a dead down, cannon shot, like kind of, where a round of explosive was going off, or landmine. It was not because of some 45 bullets from somebody's, hand pistol or anything. Sorry.
But funnily enough, it's the most enjoyable thing in this movie. Watching people getting shot and then flying around the room that was actually, that made me look up and pay attention. I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to see some more flying people. I mean, the first person he shoots, he shoots them, and they fly across the road. I mean, he just goes, and that's the way it keeps cutting back from him holding the guns, and then you see him flying, and then flying, and then flying. I mean, it's incredible to watch. I mean, totally unrealistic, but I did enjoy it in that respect. Nothing else of the movie appealed to me except for the flying bodies.
I feel like that between that and the dialogue, you felt like this was like kind of, it would make a good video game, but as a movie, like kind of just like, it was jarring. It was like kind of just where like, you just kind of like had to press like for me personally, I just had to press the, okay, I'm just going to watch this movie kind of, button, instead of like kind of trying to, like kind of trying to question things, or try to like, or try to absorb the reality of it, stuff like that. And if anything too, like if we wasn't looking at this as a remake and stuff, I probably would just like kind of at a certain point just go, okay, I'm done. kind of,
If you told me this was a video game coming out this year, I'd be first in line to buy it. But as a movie, maybe not.
It had the dialogue that you sometimes find in these video games, right? Like, like some of the things you accept from a video game is like kind of stunted, kind of cliche dialogue and stuff, and you kind of like, like kind of, because it's kind of just, almost that expectation and stuff that kind of like, like you're lucky with a video game that you have really, complex plot and kind of storytelling, stuff like that, and then if that actual dialogue is like, holy cow, like kind of, but for a movie, your expectations are kind of different.
Well, I mean, I think that's now. I think people will look back on video games, and I mean, it's one thing that drives me mad when I'm playing games like Uncharted or something like that. And like every single sort of, every 30 seconds, Nathan Drake has to say something, even if it's really mundane. It's like, oh, tripped over that. Oh, this is a tall wall, and oh, nearly missed that. And it's like, why do we need this?
Right.
And then there's some sort of 5-minute cutscene, and this whole thing of I've not seen a video game where I've enjoyed the movie portion at all, really. If you just cut, and there are people that do that, they'll cut all of the game out and they'll just sort of make a YouTube video of just the cutscenes.
Right.
They're pretty awful mostly. I mean, very few actually make a good movie. And it's almost like I kind of feel like whoever writes the stories for video games should maybe just work on making a compelling screenplay first, and then try and crowbar it into a game.
Right.
But yeah. So yeah, I don't know. Last Man Standing. Yeah, it took a lot of effort for me to keep standing by the end of that movie. It was, yeah. And the other thing that got me, there was this is just one of those little annoyances. There's a guy, right, so obviously Bruce Willis is virtually invulnerable in this movie, and he manages to shoot 1 million people and they're flying everywhere. And there's one guy who has a shot from him, almost like you can shoot him from the back and the side, from upstairs, and he's got a clear shot on him. And he shoots him once, and you know, Bruce Willis certainly doesn't have time to turn around and shoot him back. But the guy just runs away. I'm just like, you know, you've seen what this guy can do. Just unload your magazine into him. You know, why would you just run away? It doesn't make any sense. Just like, you've got to admit a clear disadvantage. Just keep shooting, and you'll gun him down. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's overall like, and it just goes with the whole thing of like, you know, that where, you know, you just push that okay, you know, kind of okay button, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, what is interesting though is this idea of action sequences directed like video games. Because one thing we haven't mentioned was the movie we were intending to compare as well this week was Hawk the Slayer.
Yeah.
Terry Marcell's classic 1980s fantasy. And in that, we'll get into why we didn't in a minute, I guess. But in that, the elf kind of shoots arrows as if he's playing a video game. Right. It's like kind of like Legolas in Lord of the Rings, but it's just hard cutting. There's no like complicated, computer graphics in between. But it's oddly satisfying to watch, and it is very much like watching like, you know, a low frame rate, 16-bit game from the 80s or the 90s. It's kind of cool in its own kind of way. And that's a lot of what reminded me with the action sequences in Last Man Standing. But yes, I don't know if you want to explain why we didn't do Hawk the Slayer.
Well, so overall, we looked at it as another unofficial remake. But as it turned out, we started kind of looking at this and comparing it also with A Bug's Life, which apparently is another unofficial remake of Seven Samurai. So next week will be really a kind of unofficial remakes, I guess, episode of these past couple of movies we've been looking at, Seven Samurai and Yojimbo. And it would be interesting kind of compare and contrast what these two movies do, and for that matter, like kind of how they kind of add to the I guess the discussion or the dialogue of kind of the to the original stories and stuff like that. Because I guess what I'm finding sometimes is that sometimes these unofficial remakes can bring more to the conversation than these official ones.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is really what it comes down to.
And just to clarify, the reason we didn't, because we read an interview where the guy who created it, Terry Marcell, and I guess the other guy, Robertson, can't remember his first name. Right. They said in this interview that they watched Yojimbo and then they wanted to make like a fantasy version of it.
Right.
And then we both, I watched it and I realized, hang on, this isn't Yojimbo at all. There's like nothing whatsoever that's even close to Yojimbo in this. And then I realized that the guy who made it got that and Seven Samurai confused. So basically, it's another remake of Seven Samurai. But for whatever reason, in this interview, he got the two movies confused and said it was Yojimbo.
Right.
Hence why we're doing another Magnificent Seven set of remakes next week. That's also because we discussed A Bug's Life. And I said, no, it's nothing like Seven Samurai. I don't know what these people are talking about. And then I watched it and realized, oh, yeah, it's exactly the same. So. Super.
So, yeah, that'll be coming up. And then another couple of weeks, we'll be looking at Planet of the Apes. So, I don't know if you have any other kind of last thoughts on this series and stuff. Otherwise.
No, not really. Okay. Just yet more, I'll be looking forward to yet more Akira Kurosawa movies.
Yeah, definitely. So thanks for watching. John Chang with Dan Edmonds, and we'll catch you next time.